Great. Thank you all so much for coming. It is a pleasure to have you guys here. My name is Jill Foster. I am Regional Director of Catholic Social Action for the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. We also have Andrew Musgrave, who is our tech help today. Andrew, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Andrew Musgrave. I'm the director of the Catholic Social Action Office for the Archdiocese. And yeah, Jill's going to be moderating, and I'll be behind the scenes monitoring chat. So any questions you might have, put them in the chat. Any other questions or problems you have with anything with Zoom, let me know, and I'll be happy to help out.
Thank you. So this is a presentation called Faith in Labor. It is based off of the Catholic social teaching of the dignity of workers and the rights of workers. But as you know, we are here to learn about Catholic social teaching. We feel like we should open up in a prayer first. And so I'll go ahead and share my screen, and Andrew and I will kind of flip-flop and read this together once I find the right screen. Here we go. So let us take a moment to recognize that we're in the presence of the Holy Spirit, who is with us always. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Glorious Saint Joseph, you are the patron of all who labor and a model of quiet strength. I ask for your guidance as I begin my work today. Help me to see my daily tasks not just as a burden or a means to an end, but as a sacred invitation to participate in God's ongoing creation.
Grant me the wisdom to work with a clear mind and a focused heart. Help me to develop the unique talents I have received, using them not for my own vanity, but for the benefit of my community and the service of the greater good. May I approach every challenge with patience and every success with gratitude.
Grant me the humility to work with integrity, especially when no one is watching. Teach me to value the dignity of every person I encounter, colleagues, clients, and competitors alike. Help me to place the needs of others above my own ambitions and to find joy in being a silent builder of a more just and peaceful world.
Grant me the spirit of service to offer my energy and my efforts for those who cannot work, for those who are unfairly treated, and for the families who depend on me. May I work with a mindfulness towards creation, caring for our common home through the choices I make in my profession.
All for the glory of God, following your example of humble labor and faithful presence. May my work today be a prayer in action, and may I return home tonight with a heart at peace. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. All right, thank you guys all so much for joining us. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Erin Shaw was raised as a Catholic in the Dayton area as well as overseas in Germany. And after struggling with her faith and religion that didn't include social teachings, Erin found Catholic social teaching and has certainly been very passionate about bringing the history and philosophy of the teachings to new life. Erin has worked in multiple everyday low-wage jobs in service, hospitality, and retail, and has spent the last decade as a consumer advocate and horse welfare advocate in the horse industry. She's worked alongside the Humane Society on rescues, worked with lawyers, medical professionals, government investigators, legislators, and other advocates to help promote consumer education and protection in multiple industries, with an emphasis on preferential option for the poor, and what meeting that looks like today in our everyday actions. So it is our pleasure to have Erin here with us.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, if you want to go ahead and start with the slides, we are going to do the way that I wanted to do this entire presentation and the series is to start with the history of Catholic social teachings. So yeah, if you want to go ahead and put those slides on there. the first thing that we're going to start off with is what exactly is Catholic social teachings. And I had not encountered Catholic social teachings as a lifelong Catholic. And when I discovered it and started talking to people about it, they were referring to Catholic social teachings as the best kept secret in the church. And so there was a very big part of me that wanted to not see this as a secret, but start to really advocate for it in my everyday life. And so here we are. So, what is Catholic social teachings? And of course, I didn't bring my book with me, but Catholic social teachings is rooted in scripture, tradition, and the magisterium. We, as far as I know, the very last fully updated Catholic social teachings that we received was in 2004, 2005, and that was from Pope St. John Paul II. So, Catholic social teachings is a very broad set of teachings that we are given guidance from the Vatican. And the Vatican also includes a lot of philosophers and educators and experts within every capacity of our everyday life to be able to understand how we can bring the gospel to life and answer any of the questions that happen today. And as our world evolves, Catholic social teachings also evolves to bring the gospel to life in our everyday. So it is philosophical. Catholic social teachings is philosophical. It utilizes all forms of science, and philosophy is a very big part of it. And philosophy requires, one of the most difficult things about philosophy is that it requires a lot of discussion. It requires a lot of patience, and it requires a lot of viewpoints. So I think personally, one of the reasons why Catholic social teachings has been one of the best kept secrets of the Catholic Church is because for a lot of us, engaging in some very difficult conversations is not a convenient way to live, but it is a necessary way for us to live. So with Pope Leo XIV, we are seeing a resurgence of Catholic social teachings because Catholic social teachings actually started with Pope Leo XIII during the Industrial Revolution. So the 7 themes of Catholic social teachings involve the dignity of the human person, community and participation, rights and responsibilities, preferential option for the poor and the vulnerable, the dignity and the rights of workers, solidarity, and care for God's creation. And so bringing philosophy to all of these matters of life is what Catholic social teachings encompasses. For today, I think that the biggest things that we are going to be talking about really are preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, the dignity and rights of workers, and community and participation. But there may be other themes that are included in what we talk about today. So, Jill, if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide. So the history of Catholic social teachings. The way that I kind of describe how Catholic social teachings came about, and I think Catholic social teachings is Catholic economics and socioeconomics. So, in our world and in the history that we are taught, we have got secular economics and secular socioeconomics. And so, in secular economics, I know that we all know the terms of capitalism and socialism and communism, which are all philosophies. And Catholic social teachings as economics and socioeconomics started during the Industrial Revolution, the second part of the Industrial Revolution. So, from a secular standpoint, what the world was going through, during the first industrial revolution, first part of it was we had a lot of technological innovation. You had trains, you had machinery that was starting to be produced, electricity. And so these inventions that had the potential to change the way the world worked and did change the way the world worked, we started to see these inventions start to come to life. And then during the second revolution, the second industrial revolution, we saw those inventions start to have processes and procedures and materials that were able to allow those technologies to advance. So when you had things like the locomotive during the first industrial revolution, there was a process that came out during the second industrial revolution called the Bessemer process. And as an example, this process was able to make steel cheaper, faster to be able to produce, and more accessible. So we had this steam engine, this locomotive that was invented during the first industrial revolution. And then once steel became more accessible, more inexpensive, you started to see railways explode and expand. And with that, we'll talk about it a little bit later, we started to see the people who were at the ground level of those technologies be able to amass this huge amount of wealth. And those are names that we all know, names like Rockefeller, Carnegie, and we'll talk about that later. What a lot of Catholics in my research, I didn't realize the Catholic history that went alongside the secular history, but this is where immigration really started to take off into the United States. And a lot of that immigration was Catholic immigration. So it was German Catholics, Irish Catholics, Italian Catholics. And so the immigrants who were coming over during that Industrial Revolution were a very large portion of the Catholic population in the United States. And we started to see the Catholic population of the United States get larger and larger during that Industrial Revolution. So when the United States, when the secular world started to move more out of an agrarian society into an industrial society, these industrial cities where there was a lot of opportunities for jobs started to become heavily immigrant cities. And I think when we all learned history, whether you went to a secular school or whether you went to a Catholic school, we had industrial issues. Like, I think a lot of us are familiar with something like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. So a lot of these immigrants that were coming into the United States, a good portion of them that were Catholic, were subject to very harsh working conditions. They had work days that were 10, 12-hour days. A lot of the people who were working were children, women, and we had poor working conditions because we didn't have any government regulation that helped protect any of these workers. So a lot of people were working in factories that were overcrowded and where they didn't have safe exits. So this is where an opportunity for government regulation happened. But for a lot of us that work in the legislative side of the population, we have a rule, or we have a saying that regulations are written in blood. And so during this time, you had a high amount of deaths, a high amount of sicknesses because of exposure to toxic chemicals, because of like I said, poor regulations and poor safety precautions that were meant to protect workers. And that is how a lot of regulation ended up happening. Was we had these large catastrophes like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, or if anybody is familiar with a story called the Radium Girls, where there were women that were in factories that were painting watch faces, and those watch faces were using radium as the paint. And so the women were licking the paintbrushes and then licking the radium, and they fell ill. So a lot of these immigrants, and a lot of those immigrants that were Catholics, were subject to very harsh lives because they came here for an opportunity to economically advance. And what they were seeing was exploitation. There wasn't an opportunity to advance, and the conditions of their lives weren't really improving. So, Jillian, if you want to go to the next slide. Like I said, secular economics and Catholic social teachings economics really go hand in hand. At this point, the Catholic Church didn't have any type of formal economics to guide their lay people and to guide their clergy, but we had what were called labor priests that were very early on, and those labor priests were in immigrant heavy communities. So during the Industrial Revolution, we've got these businesses that were able to get in on the ground level of all of this technology that was being invented and then was skyrocketing. So I think a lot of us kind of understand that if you're able to get in early on a trend or get in early and be an early investor in something that is going to take off, the expectation is that that's going to make you a lot of money. With that large sum of money, you end up having a lot of economic power. And so this is where monopolies are born. Now, if anybody is familiar with capitalism and the birth of capitalism, capitalism as a system, and this is what I'm going to go into in my next series or in my next session, but capitalism as an economic theory was from the philosopher Adam Smith, a Scottish 17th century philosopher. And one of the things that Adam Smith warned about was the power of monopolies. So a lot of us are aware of the game Monopoly, but not a lot of people understand that monopoly is meant to teach us an economic lesson of how much power that monopolies can have in an economy and how detrimental that monopolies can be. So Rockefeller was a huge monopolist when it came to the oil industry. Carnegie was a huge monopolist when it came to the steel industry. And for these people that got in on the ground level in economics, we have something called a barrier to market entry. And what that barrier to market entry means is that when these people amass this huge amount of wealth and they're the only ones that can afford the technology to be able to go into business with that technology, there is not really an opportunity for small businesses to enter the market and be able to compete. So these monopolists get in on the ground level and then they essentially control the entire market and they control a good portion of the economy because of that from the business standpoint, but then also because of their wealth. So one of the things I think from a kind of a common socioeconomic standpoint, or when you talk to people about people's opportunity to economically advance, the way that business people should ideally be able to advance is that they become specialized workers at what they do, and then they're able to grow within a company. So you've got these ground level workers who are the ones that are in the trenches, in the day-to-day activities, and they become very good at the jobs that they are able to do. But when they're making these low wages because they are low income workers, and there's not a lot of room for economic advancement because we like to use the term climbing the ladder, it's not really a ladder, it's more of a pyramid scheme. It's more of a pyramid. You've got your ground level workers and you've got a good amount of ground level workers, and then a higher level of management only has a smaller number of positions. And then the further up the pyramid you go, there's less opportunity to be able to advance. So we had these workers who were so specialized, we have these workers who are so specialized in what they do, but they're making low wages and there's not room for them to advance. And then the people who were really, really good at making the economy go were the ones that were just stuck. So in capitalism, we have, again, it's an economic philosophy that was thought up, that was brought to us by Adam Smith, who was very passionate about morals and very passionate about ethics. We've got capitalism is kind of a mixture of his philosophy and his philosophical views from a book called Theory of Moral Sentiments, or books for Theory of Moral Sentiments, but he also had Wealth of Nations. So this is where he really came up with trying to get people out of a feudalist system and giving them an opportunity to become specialized workers and then have an opportunity to advance economically. And a lot of his moral guidelines were aimed at leveling the playing field for all workers to be able to economically advance and gain private ownership of capital that would help them live within their means and then maybe have a comfortable life. Now, that is what capitalism was supposed to look like. But what we had during the Industrial Revolution shifted into what's called crony capitalism. So in crony capitalism, you have wealthy business people who've got a lot of impact on the economy, and they've got also a lot of impact on legislation. So you've got business people who are either going into politics themselves, or you've got good business people who are paying off politicians to either look the other way or pass favorable legislation for them at the expense of small businesses and at the expense of the general public. And again, this time period that is happening is after Adam Smith's economic theories on what a moral economy and a just economy should look like. So during the Industrial Revolution, we have this huge wealth gap. We've got large economic inequality, a lot of immigrants who came in for thinking that they were going to get a better life, and then they were trapped within an economy where they really were not going to be able to advance because of those working conditions, because of those low income jobs and low wages. So in the 1890s, there was legislation that was passed, and it was our very first what's called antitrust legislation. So antitrust is meant to break up trusts, which were corporations that were managed all together, and they were kind of able to stack the deck against, again, smaller businesses or the working class. So we have the Sherman antitrust legislation that's passed. It's our very first antitrust legislation. And because of crony capitalism, it was very much not enforced. So it was actually used against labor unions and workers who were trying to fight for better rights, better working conditions, and better wages. That antitrust legislation was not really enforced until early in the 1900s. Teddy Roosevelt was a huge advocate for enforcing antitrust legislation, which is why he earned the nickname. Sorry, I'm buffering a little bit, but it's why he earned the nickname Trust Busting Teddy. So let's see. So what happened then was that business markets and opportunities heavily favored the wealthy. Wealthy people were able to hoard their wealth and their economic power, and then they were passing that on to their children, not allowing everyday working class people to economically advance or even go into business for themselves to be able to advance. The deck was so heavily stacked against them that when you were born in a class, for the most part, you stayed in that class, with a few exceptions of people who were able to climb that ladder, which, like I said earlier, is essentially a pyramid. If you want to go to the next slide. All right, so during this time, Catholic social teaching was brought to Catholics. Like I said, we've got some of the legislation that is happening in the secular world, but then we've got the Catholic world. And we had a very early, again, what's called labor priest. His name was Father Edward McGlynn, and he was problematic for a number of reasons, but he was actually excommunicated from the church because of his advocacy for labor unions and the working class. And he was excommunicated for suspicion of, or basically allegations of, being a socialist. Again, he was very far from perfect. There were a lot of other things about him, but on this one, he was very right. And so we got Rerum Novarum in 1891 with Pope Leo XIII. So after Rerum Novarum, Father Edward McGlynn was reinstated into the Catholic Church. He was still difficult to rein in, but there were people, and the reason that I make the point of him is that he really pushed and reminded the Catholic Church of what their duty was in bringing the gospel to life. So 1891, what this did was, obviously the Catholic Church only had a limited amount of influence over the global population. And the amount of influence that it had was over Catholics. So what it did was it directed the Catholics throughout the world. It gave them guidance on taking a step back and facing economic issues with biblical guidance. It updated the gospel to modern times and gave Catholics an opportunity to have a more clear stance on how they should live their lives. Now, a lot of people from the secular world, obviously, you've got capitalism and socialism and communism, and we will go into that in the next session. But what this did was it criticized all forms of economics. And I think that's a big thing that a lot of people miss, is that what has happened now politically and historically politically is that you'll have people who will align with economic theory, and the Catholic social teachings tells us we can't be committed to one economic theory. We have to continue to reevaluate and continue to assess it. And so it criticized all of these forms of economics. It denounced unregulated capitalism that didn't have a conscience, where people had this rugged sense of individualism, and they lost their sense of being considerate of how they affected other people when it came to how they interacted with their money as consumers, as business owners, as managers. So it brought back a sense of community to capitalism. It also criticized socialism without a person. And again, I'm going to go into all of this. I think a lot of socialism and a lot of communism are very heavily criticized. So I'm going to focus, as far as this goes, on capitalism and the criticisms of capitalism and how accurate we look at capitalism versus the initial philosophy and the lens of Catholic social teachings. The Catholic social teachings didn't advocate for any specific economic system. It advocated for economic justice. At this time, I had talked about earlier in the secular world, we had seen antitrust legislation be weaponized against unions. And we see a lot of anti-union propaganda now. And it's been that way, as I know, my entire life. I didn't know any of the history of unions. I wasn't educated on unions or labor organizing. But labor unions had historically and still continue to have bad reputations. This was the first time that the Catholic Church had supported the rights of workers to organize, the rights of them to bargain collectively, and especially when there isn't protective legislation. I think that's a big part of what was happening then, was that because of crony capitalism, because you had people who were only looking at their own opportunity to build profit and build empires, they were able to pay off politicians to remove any of the barriers that would keep them from being profitable. And that included the barriers that looked at workers with human dignity and protected their human dignity. So if you want to go to the next slide, Jelly. So here's where the historical parallels come in, and this is why Catholic social teachings, in my opinion, and it's looking like it's coming to fruition, this is why they're making a resurgence, is that the historical parallels from that industrial revolution, from the first and second industrial revolutions to now, are the historical parallels are paralleling. So in the 1970s, 1980s, obviously in the 1970s, we had stagflation. The economy wasn't doing well. And so during the 1980s, we had an opportunity for new technology to change the American and global economic worldview. So our economy expanded globally. I want to say that it was 1979 is when the manufacturing peaked within the United States. So in 1979 is where we had the most manufacturing jobs within the United States. And then outsourcing really started to take off more than keeping manufacturing jobs back in the United States. And so our our economy shifted from a manufacturing economy into a service, retail, and hospitality economy. So we had that industrial revolution that shifted us from an agrarian society more to an industrial society. And then during the 1980s, we shifted out of a manufacturing society and into service, retail, and hospitality society. So the majority of the jobs were humanities-based jobs. They were people interacting with other people and consumers getting experiences, going to theme parks, going to restaurants. And that was really what became the backbone of our society. So the same way during the Industrial Revolution that people were able to invest in new technologies. We had cell phones, we had computers, we had the internet, we had all of this technological advancement that started in the 1980s and has continued to explode. And now we're seeing the rise of AI, which is yet another change within our economy and how it shapes the way that we live our lives. When we have those people that are able to get in on the ground level, that's where we start to see monopolies and monopolists and these larger businesses. We've got huge retail stores, Target, Walmart, all of these behemoths, large grocery chain. And we started to see the mom and pop stores go out of not only fashion, but they didn't have an ability to remain competitive with those larger chains. So the thing about antitrust legislation and trying to break up monopolies is that it is always a situation where it's kind of hindsight is 2020. In the business world, we have like this term called bait and switch, where you kind of make a deal with the devil. We get the convenience that these larger businesses are able to offer us. We get things that are faster. We get everything that we want in one place. They're more convenient, and at a later date, we figure out that deal with the devil meant that small businesses really weren't able to compete against these larger chains. So I'll talk a little bit more about that because that changed the way that our economy and our society was able to operate. But what also happened was that during the 1980s, we really saw a lot of white collar workers, a lot of white collar jobs, an increase in jobs where there started to become a requirement that you had to have a college degree to be able to get them. So as we shifted into a service, retail, and hospitality economy, we also saw a little bit more of a separation of classes, as far as we have a working class, a lower level class, and then we have an upper management, middle management class. And that wealth gap, as well as from a society standpoint, the way that we viewed each other started to separate. Because of those class separations, people were not intermingling because of income disparities, and simply because there was a separation for the most part in kind of viewing how well people were able to. I'm trying to think of the best way to say this. The best way to say, I have to be intentional about the way that I say this, but college degrees were looked at as an accomplishment that separated people who didn't have a college degree. And there was an aspect of human dignity that went with whether people were able to obtain a college degree or whether they weren't, if that makes sense. And if anybody has any questions about kind of what I'm trying to say here, feel free to drop it right in the chat and we'll talk about that later. Now, here is the thing that I think a lot of people don't fully understand, and I myself didn't understand this for a long time, was really how money in politics works. And corporate lobbying has become something that not a lot of people fully understand. Again, I myself it's a lot of work to research corporate lobbying. It's a ton of work. But there's that resurgence of crony capitalism that we have had. It's that corporate lobbyists are able to go in and lobby legislators for favorable legislation that benefits them at the expense of smaller businesses and at the expense of the workforce and at the expense of the environment and consumer protection. It is yet again a resurgence of big money, whether it's private big money, whether it's corporate big money, whether it is what are called business associations, that their real goal is to get this favorable legislation passed. And the end goal on that, more often than not, very much more often than not, is to increase their profits and remove the barriers that increase their profits to increasing those profits. And so when that happens, there's not really anybody looking out for consumers or for smaller businesses or for the workers. And there are people who are working, they're looking out for that. But the issue with that is that those people are heavily out moneyed when it comes to corporate lobbying. So crony capitalism has been back in fashion for quite some time. And they were able to enact a lot of legislation over the past couple of decades that removed the barriers or the protections that a lot of us were benefiting from in our everyday lives. So socially, the human dignity of the lowest income earners has been attacked. And this is where kind of that Catholic social teachings, when we talk about preferential option for the poor, is we have opportunities in here the same way that we did in the 1890s to be able to educate ourselves and to be able to stand in solidarity with those low income workers, because the reality is that not a lot of people are going to be able to financially help the amount of people that need financial help. And so the best thing that we can do is get ourselves educated and stand in solidarity with these workers and help educate our friends and our family to be able to give us that same power that wealthy elites have when it comes to passing legislation. If any of that makes sense. If you want to go to the next slide. The new industrial revolution. So Pope Leo XIV has talked about this pretty much since he became Pope. And this is going to be a really big part. I don't know how many people that are in on this have also followed Georgetown's Catholic Social Action or Catholic Social Thought. This was a webinar that they did where they talked about the new industrial revolution being AI. And artificial intelligence at this point we don't even know how many ways this is touching our lives. And I think that's kind of the scary part, that we really need to confront. That scary part is that we're seeing AI have an opportunity. There is obviously an opportunity with anything for it to do a good amount of good, but there's also an opportunity for it to do a good amount of very, very bad things. So as AI is not only continuing to advance, but it's also concentrated in the hands of a very small, wealthy individual, like a very small amount of wealthy individual people. And the fact that AI has an opportunity to impact every single one of us in ways that we don't know, this is something that a lot of us should really think about Catholic social teachings when we're starting to see AI influence our lives. Now, technology has already reduced a good portion of jobs. And I talked about earlier how we transitioned into a service, retail, and hospitality economy. So the backbone of our economy was interacting with other people. The backbone of our economy has been for a very long time going out to eat and being served by a waiter or waitress, going out to a theme park and interacting with the theme park members. If you've got elderly parents, having your elderly parents cared for by a caregiver. All of these jobs we are at a point where there's an opportunity for those, and they already have been replaced by technology, which reduces the amount of jobs, but it also reduces the amount of humanity that we interact with on an everyday basis. Um, so there's the economic aspect of those jobs are being reduced by machines. And when they are reduced by machines, the people who own the technology are able to profit an insane amount because they don't have the labor budgets or the labor costs that it takes for them to invest in people. They're also reducing jobs to where we now have to fight amongst each other. We've got unemployed workers. We've got a good amount of unemployed workers who've been replaced with AI. We've also got a problem called underemployment. And we'll talk about this again in a later session, but underemployment essentially means that people are not being paid enough to be able to maintain just their basic meeting their basic needs, but then at least having enough to be able to get a comfortable savings to be able to prepare for emergencies, as well as being able to just have some sort of dignity in their lives. So when people are underemployed to that amount, they have to have more than one job. So now we've got unemployment that is rising because of the reduction in jobs, but we've also got underemployment, which keeps people fighting amongst each other for job opportunities and increases the divisiveness that we have in our society. The additional AI threats that we have is the environmental destruction. The amount of energy, the amount of water that it takes to power AI data centers is more than we can afford. And what's happening legislative wise is something that I've been following what's happening in Ohio, and it's happening in a few other states. There are a couple of other things that are happening is that private equity is starting to take over, starting to buy utility companies so that they can privatize and be able to give data centers preference, so to where data centers are able to get the energy that they need before average everyday citizens are able to get energy, which is a huge problem. It's also causing energy costs to rise, which puts further strain on the average family. It is and when that happens, again, under crony capitalism, people do not have an opportunity to advocate for their own justice and justice within their communities against these tech behemoths that have more money than these communities have, and they've got more power. So the environmental impacts of AI are, at this point, there's still a question mark, but the way that I tell people when I'm talking to this is if you would not want a data center in your backyard, you need to be paying attention, because through the lens of Catholic social teaching, if you would not want it in your backyard, we need to be advocating for them to not be in anybody's backyard. And that level of education is something that the American population is, where myself included, we are not at yet. And these are coming in fast. They're coming in fast, faster than we can educate ourselves and organize. The other thing with AI is that it has an opportunity to manipulate markets. We have seen this if you have somebody that you know who is a renter. Rent has gone through the roof, and the increase in rent has outpaced wages astronomically, especially since 2023, 2022. Our next session, we will have a legislator from Ohio. His name is Louis Blessing, and he has been working on this for a very long time. But there is an algorithm that is used by a couple of companies called RealPage and Yardi, and the algorithm is unknown. But at this point, it appears that the reason that rent has increased dramatically and caused a strain on people's income has to do with these algorithms. So it's not landlords, it's not mom and pop landlords that we're dealing with that invest in a rental property and they care about their renters. What we have are large companies that are utilizing algorithms to increase their profit, and people are increasingly becoming homeless and having to live with friends and family members because the option is that they are out on the street. And right now, that is a huge problem in the state of Ohio because rent control and rent stabilization were made illegal by corporate lobbyists in, I believe, 2022. I'll have to look back. It was either 22 or 23. So this is where AI and that crony capitalism have created a storm for us in the state of Ohio, especially as far as renters goes. So if you are a renter, or if your children are renters, or if your grandchildren are renters, this very well could have already affected you. Again, the concentration of power. Current AI techs have concentrated economic power. They are social media. I think everybody at this point has social media. We only have a small amount of social medias to choose from. They have their own algorithms that we don't know how those algorithms work, and how much of our data that they have, how much of our data that they have, how much of it they sell, and what they're doing with that data. But also, when they are able to get permission of our data and use it for their own devices, like creating images that are made in our likeness, we don't even have power over the pictures of our faces or the pictures of the faces of our grandchildren, which in a time like this has become a terrifying reality. So these are all things that, looking at Catholic social teaching and looking at the human dignity of all of us, versus looking at the wealthy people and falling into the trap of idolizing the wealthy people who are the decision makers in this company, is going to be something that is going to be very important over the next few years. So next slide. Okay. Catholic social teaching and its ability to solve modern problems. Catholic social teachings is political. There's a lot of debate, and we hear a lot of people who say, I don't want to talk politics, but unfortunately, everything is political. Everything is not partisan, but everything is political. Whether you're able to afford healthcare, whether you're able to afford to go on vacation, if you can't afford to take time off, if you are sick and you're able to afford to go to the doctor or take time off to go to the doctor, everything is political. But so Catholic social teaching starts with, what is the human dignity of each person, and is it honored in the way that we decide that we want society to operate? Catholic social teachings helps us as Catholics be interactive in making those decisions. The role of Catholic social teaching is to solve current disconnect. So in Catholic social teachings, when we talk about community and participation, when we talk about rights and responsibilities, when we talk about solidarity, all of those things include being able to sit down and having very real conversations and very meaningful conversations with the people around us, and it not exclusively our family members, with anybody that we come into contact to. It gives us an opportunity to meaningfully listen to the struggles that again, from a preferential option for the poor, it gives us an opportunity for us to listen to those struggles and not extend only charity, but also to figure out a way how to stand in solidarity, to be able to say, how can we help? And when how can we help turns into something meaningful, it creates a society where we don't have to force people to rely on charity and begging for help one singular time. It's an opportunity to empower. The Catholic opportunity to lead the way and to fulfill the mission of the gospel through purposeful and intentional economics in our everyday actions helps us create new community. I think one of the big things that a lot of us talk about in advocacy, and a lot of us talk about, honestly, really in our everyday lives, is that I think a lot of people don't really know that we yearn for community. We really yearn for community, and to be able to sit down and create community where it is a mindful community, it is intentional community, but it is authentic community. I think that for a lot of us, we have been lacking a sense of authenticity, a sense of being able to roll up our sleeves and look at work that needs to be done as challenging. And sometimes it's like super not fun. Sometimes we're tired. A lot of us are tired from work. A lot of us are tired from family obligations, shuttling kids to places and having commitments. A lot of us are tired, but I have found in my own personal life that in putting your head down and doing that really hard work and building community that serves everyone, it creates a kind of community that can't be replicated by spending money and can't be replicated by just going and trying to have a fun experience. So, Catholics have an opportunity, a unique opportunity to find these Catholic social teachings and find new meaning in them and lead the way by example. A lot of us will say, find the helpers. When there's things that are going on and the world is on fire and there's chaos and pandemonium everywhere, find the people who are already able to say, this is what we need, and direct people and show real leadership qualities instead of just saying, here's what you need to do, be on your way, we're done. Catholics have that opportunity right now. And I think that's a huge opportunity for a lot of us to find fulfillment and find community. The opportunity for Catholics to revisit humble beginnings. I think that's huge. I think a lot, this is my personal opinion, is that authenticity in showing up for people, and that authenticity in listening to people's pain and suffering and trying to meaningfully help is an opportunity for Catholics to really not only be grateful for the things that we do have and the struggles that aren't ours, but to also find meaning in helping people instead of just abandoning them. And to advocate for justice, to stand alongside them after listening to them, after being there for the very dark and difficult parts, saying, what do you need, and standing and really doing the work. It is an opportunity that, again, can't be replicated, I don't think. Also, in the long run, standing up, helping people stand up for justice, economic justice, will decrease the need for charity. And the thing about charity is that when we perform charity, it makes us feel good. But there's a certain aspect of forcing people to beg for charity becomes somewhat dehumanizing, as though their work that they do, going to a 40-hour work week, low income job, as if they didn't earn the human dignity in that, if that makes sense, is that decreasing the need for charity will also give people the gift of their human dignity back because they get more autonomy and more independence. So if you want to go to the next slide. Okay, so reflection. What I wanted to do here at this point were what are the moral questions that we see behind the economic problems of today? If people want me to answer these from my own personal standpoint, I can, but really I'm just asking everybody to kind of sit back and, again, in our everyday lives, it's so easy for us to spend money. It is so easy for us. We're kind of on autopilot when it comes to things, and we're just thinking about the next thing instead of taking a step back and looking at all of our everyday actions and saying, what is the impact of our everyday actions? So what are the moral questions that we see behind the economic problems of today? Where do we see the church's teachings needed the most right now? How do we put these solutions? How do we put solutions to these problems into action in our everyday lives? So if we identify the problems, and we can see what the problems are, how would we put action to those problems, and how would we do that through Catholic social teachings? What would that look like? And as far as kind of bringing back the disconnect that a lot of people have when they say they don't want to talk politics, I don't want to talk politics. If we really started to sit back and think about how many political statements that we make in our everyday life, I can't go out to eat because we can't afford it. We've got whatever medical issues that we've got going on. Really starting to think about how many of the things that I say actually are political, and how do we help talking to other people, connecting the dots, and giving that an opportunity to create community in common and shared struggles. So that that is what I've got for session one.
Thank you so much, Erin. Please feel free if you have any questions to put them in the chat. I thought that you did a fantastic job, Erin. I know certainly I was reflecting a bit on, I certainly have family members who are like, capitalism is a good system. And I like how you started like, there was someone with pure intentions who, formulated it, but as Catholics, we should remain alert that, things can be corrupted. Because this is a fallen world. And so I thought that was really interesting. I know if you have questions for Erin about her presentation, awesome. Uh, if you want to voice your question, you can use the raise hand function, and we can release you from muteness. But while we're waiting, while people are thinking about their questions, I know we have a planned series, and if you had just like a brief, like, okay, this is what we're going to talk about kind of next time in general.
Yeah, yeah. So when you talked about capitalism, and I also I'm a huge nerd when it comes to the philosophy of economics. So both for Adam Smith, who was the father of capitalism and the father of economics, and his theory of moral sentiments and all of his works, and really kind of how they've become distorted, to me is kind of a tragedy, because it was something that it was so beautiful, and we've seen it be corrupted and manipulated, and not truly. A lot of us, myself, until I read his works, didn't know how much of what we know capitalism is now is actually not what he intended it for. And so, which is a huge bummer to me, because he was a philosopher who loved morality. And unfortunately, philosophers back then, when they were on their deathbed, would have their unfinished works burned. So we don't really know a lot of I would have liked that. Unfortunately, he wasn't thinking of me when he was on his deathbed. So it was rude. But so we're going to talk more about all of those. We're going to talk about not just that, but we're going to talk about communism, because I think it's the same thing. There's a lot of people kind of don't understand what happened in history around when that philosophy came about. We have Louis Blessing, who is a senator, who's going to come in, and he's going to talk about, and he's done really great work as far as, he tried to introduce a $15 minimum wage for the state of Ohio, and he and I have some disagreements on some things, but I'm really proud of how much legislation that he does that is in line with Catholic social teachings. And so we're going to talk about economics. We're going to talk about more of Catholic social teaching and labor movements. And I think, you and Andrew and I had talked about one thing, that if there is any interest, that I think is really important right now, is economics and mental health. I think it's huge. We talked about mental health struggles of people who are living in poverty, but also as our economy is taking a downturn, and we're seeing a lot of people who are facing jobs being lost, or an increase in their cost of living, and they're not able to afford it, how much that really affects their personhood and their human dignity. And then it makes our society more disharmonious. I want to say, we have a lot of people have tied their self-worth, myself included, have tied our self-worth to our job, our status, our money. And when we are not able to afford to meet our basic needs, or when our ability to stay current with bills is threatened, not a lot of people know how to handle that. So we've talked about doing that. So if anybody has any requests also, but yeah, over the next series is going to dive more into economic theories and then what capitalism or what Catholic social teaching has to say about them.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I do know there's a number of folks who work or volunteer in parishes on here. Do you have any advice for them? Because you are very familiar with kind of the situations of people in poverty and everything, about how, kind of tying into, you talked about mental health and other things. Do you have any advice or just quick words of wisdom for those who are currently working or volunteering in our parishes?
Uh, I would say the best advice is to get in the trenches as much as you can with people. There is a loneliness that comes with poverty, especially when you are living in, especially if you're living in a world that is so built on rugged individualism, and there's a feeling of failure when you can't provide for your families. So get in the trenches and really listen to them and encourage your friends and family members to think about the way that they speak about poor people. That's a huge thing. The way they speak about low income workers. Not a lot of people really understand what it looks like to be a low income worker, but also we interact so much with low income workers who are in need. Um, really thinking about asking ourselves, how do we help restore their human dignity, and genuinely, how do we become more appreciative of the people who are in the trenches of those low income jobs in a way that starts to include them, where they're not excluded by not being able to afford engaging with other people. And so I think that, like I said, there's an opportunity for community building. And I think the biggest thing is that these statistically, I want to say September last year, 44% of workers were not making living wage, which is huge. That's almost half of the population. And then we wonder why we're so divided. So it's an opportunity for us to sit and come up with new ways to create community and come up with new models of community creation. And unfortunately, I can't give any of the answers because I don't have them. But I think us starting to think about ways in which we can create consistent community with people who have been excluded and who are on the margins is going to be something that, once we can figure out how to start that ball rolling, all it takes is a spark to
Yes,
light a fire. So,
absolutely. And if any of these folks from the parishes or otherwise would like to get in touch with you, is it all right? I can certainly connect you guys. Would you be open to that?
yeah, absolutely. I come on down.
So if you would like to get in touch with Erin, and we'll have some more series on this subjects as well. We have not set a date yet, so please keep an eye out. I think I have most of your guys's information who are on here. Um, Keep an eye out. I'll also be sending out a link. We'll be publicizing a link for this recording as well. If you'd like to reach Erin, please feel free to reach out to me or Andrew. My email is jfoster@catholicaoc.org. You can easily find that on the Archdiocese of Cincinnati website under the Catholic Social Action Office too, and our phone numbers are there as well. Any final words?
No, I think I think we're just kind of getting started. It feels like I feel like I've been a crazy person for a couple of years saying this. We have this joke that when somebody discovers something that's already existed, that I just Christina Columbus this, it's mine now. But I think that we are at the beginning of seeing a resurgence in Catholic social teachings, which I'm excited about. Um, but again, it's philosophy and this is work. This is all work. So for me, that type of work excites me. I'm excited to see where this goes. I've got a lot of hope for it. So
Thank you. Andrew, any final words?
I just want to echo what Jill said. Thank you very much, Erin, for doing this, for doing all the work and the preparation and sharing your wisdom, your thoughts on this. I think you did a fantastic job, and really appreciate having the folks here to hear, but also to be able to record this and share. Excuse me, share this more widely through our network. So thanks for doing that, and thanks Jill for helping to coordinate this, and thanks all of you for being here to. And taking time on your weeknight to be a part of this conversation, and hopefully we'll see you again for the future sets parts of these series.
Thank
genuinely,
you.
thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you guys for giving me this platform. We already talked about it. I could cry. This was a huge responsibility for me, and I don't take it lightly. I love it. But also thank you to anybody who listened. That I'm a poor person. I live in poverty. I learned this the hard way, and I really appreciate everybody who took the time out to think that this was interesting enough to do it because it means a lot.
Thank you so much, Erin. I'll go ahead and stop the recording now.